So a little bit of a biography. I'm going to be talking about this a little bit more at length tonight. But when I was raised cradle Catholic, what I often talk about my experience as an early kid is being very underwhelmed by Catholicism, both intellectually, artistically. I would say that for the most part, my experience of Catholicism growing up just didn't feel very deep. I was in a certain regard, very much my parents were relatively devout. But when I was growing up, you got to remember this was the time before social media, the 90s. This was before Bishop Barron's Catholicism series. This is before the catechism was being widely used or widely available. And I remember just thinking on a daily, regular basis that it just didn't seem very overwhelmingly beautiful. So when I was in high school, like I mentioned, I got into Rage Against the Machine, and I started being challenged by radical left ideas. And they started to make sense to me. I read the Communist Manifesto, was getting into activism. I was also, I'm a little bit of an eclectic person. I was an athlete. I played soccer for 4 years of high school and 1 year in college. I also did theater and art. And in a certain regard, the secular world was engaging me at a very high level. Between the art, I was living just north of New York City as 8th grade through college. I ended up going to SUNY Albany. And when I was nearing the end of high school, I really wanted to go to New York City to be an artist. I wanted to be a writer, so I had an interest in writing, painting, also acting. I did a lot of that. I was actually in a few NYU student films. I don't know what became of those films. Maybe one day they'll surface. So I was connected with the art scene in New York City and Albany. I chose Albany not because I particularly cared about the college, but I wanted to be close to the art scenes. And in Albany, Albany is kind of an extension of New York City. A lot of artists will tour by going to New York City, Philadelphia, but they'll live in Albany because it's a lot cheaper, and it still is kind of a big city, artsy-fartsy scene. So in college, I fell away from the faith and was kind of caught up with kind of left-wing activism, intellectual scene. I don't know if you've ever heard of, have you guys ever heard of Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher? You've heard, I actually saw him lecture, and a lot of my professors were friends with him. So it was a different world. The professors would throw parties, and a lot of the students that were kind of on certain inside tracks, the graduate students, I would kind of hang out with that scene and the art scene in New York City. Long story short, I made a lot of bad life choices and had to kind of get my act together, if you will. And I moved back in with my parents in North Carolina. At that time, what drew me in was I started going to the Maronite liturgy with my parents. And I experienced the Eastern churches. Now, a lot of people claim that I have a very Eastern vibe to me. There is a lot of truth in that. And a lot of it was when I came alive to the faith was the incense and the beauty of the Maronite rite. It just really spoke to me, and there was a depth to it. You guys also don't remember what the old translation of the Mass used to be like. So the old translation was, I'm trying to think, you guys probably didn't even grow up with it. It was, you remember that, it was kind of fluffy. And then I started encountering this deeper theology. There's a prayer actually I teach the students, a Maronite chant, where it goes, "You have united, O Lord, your divinity with our humanity, and our humanity with your divinity, your life with our mortality, and our mortality with your life." And so I got struck up in this St. John of the Cross, St. John Paul II, who wasn't a saint at the time, Pope Benedict, all of these, have a go, no worries. All of these great contemplative, philosophical thinkers. And I started to get enamored with the idea of the mystical journey, the mystical union. And then I started discerning a vocation. So the interesting thing, and I'm going to kind of get to the metaverse stuff, is I really wasn't interested in technology as a seminarian. I had minimal contact with social media. I did a little bit of Facebook when I was in seminary, older generation. But then towards the end of my seminary, I had these ideas that I wanted to share. And I realized that nobody was ever going to publish a priest from rural North Carolina. That the only way I could ever talk about prayer in the spiritual life is by starting a website and a blog. So I started to do that. I started to start a website. Then I got into video. And what I started to realize was just this idea of adapting to technology. I didn't do it. I would say I don't have a deep love for technology. I was talking with Tim today. I said, at some point, if our media apostolate really grows, where like I'm like a Bishop Barron or something, I probably will go back to having a flip phone. I probably will try to get rid of a smartphone as soon as I'm able, and then I don't need it for work. So I don't have a deep love for technology. But what I started to realize was I had to go where the attention was. You see that a lot in marketing. You see that, and I resigned myself that we were just going to adapt to where the attention was. So we jumped on TikTok, like it was like 3 or 4 years. How long ago was it, Tim? 3 or 4 years ago? Yeah, it was like 2 or 3 years ago. It was before COVID. We jumped on TikTok, not because I recommended it. Actually, it was a struggle early on. I said, to parents, I don't recommend that you let your kids be on TikTok, but if they're there anyways, they can look us up, Catholic Priest 3. And we made modest gains because we were one of the first priests. There's other people who've exceeded us on that. But we got into Instagram, all these things, not because I had a particular need for it, but that just simply was where the attention was. And what I found with ECU Newman, even though my audience is relatively small, it's in North Carolina, is that through aesthetics and through art, I was able to shape a lot of the minds of the people that were around me. We saw all kinds of things at ECU Newman. It went from being a laid-back kind of like hippie kind of environment where everybody's wearing sandals and flip-flops and not really serious, where now people dress up and they take things seriously. And a lot of that was because through art and aesthetics and marketing, we just raised the level of what people wanted. So now, what you've been waiting for, MetaCatholic, metaverse. How did I get into the metaverse? I was talking with a student. Meta had come out with, they had made their announcement that they were changing their name to Meta. Everybody was talking about it. To be honest with you, I really didn't care. And I was just having a one-on-one with a student that I work with on philosophy and economics. And a light bulb went off where he said, game economics are almost now becoming like world economics. There was a famous study that one of these video games, the currency in the video game was worth more than the Japanese yen. Like it had more market value than the Japanese yen. So this is before cryptocurrency. This is before Bitcoin. This was actually a cryptocurrency in a kind of a simpler form. Before all of the blockchain technology, all of that. There are things, like for example, if Fortnite, you take the game Fortnite, and I've talked with Tim Sweeney actually, my friend worked on Fortnite. You take their skins, and if you allowed, and Tim's very intentional about this, not allowing this, if you allowed for exchanges on the free market, the prices could go way up and things like that. These digital assets have real value. So people were bartering and trading these gaming assets. And when I started to realize that, I was like, what would stop us? My early idea was, what would stop us from some of these video games where you can buy real estate and you can create worlds? What would stop us from throwing a chapel in the middle of that and taking up collections? I was thinking about that. Like if we just had a chapel in the game and you could make donations to the chapel when you came and worshiped with your player. This was early ideas. We've kind of evolved since that. I was like, what would stop somebody from donating their tokens from the game to the chapel, and then we could cash that out as a revenue? So that was some of the early ideas. Maybe we should go back to some of those ideas. Well, then the student had a VR headset. How many of you guys have an Oculus headset? Any of you have an Oculus? Hey, so none of you guys have an Oculus headset, the VR. Next time, I'll promise you sometime in the next year or so, I have 20 headsets so I could bring them and show you guys.
So we have them in our lab, right?
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Oh, you have the Oculus headset?
Yeah,
you
I'm
might.
not sure how much they're used, but we do have them.
You should spend time on them, getting used to it, because the way things are going with, so the Oculus headset is a huge breakthrough. So you have the headset, you can have immersive. Right now, the basic way the technology works is if you can build it in Unity or Unreal. How many of you know Unity, Unreal? Does anybody not know that? Somewhat. So those are the engines that you do to create video games. So this is what we learned next. So this student, he helped me out a little bit, but then we made a breakthrough when we found Jason, who we now work with, is he was doing animation for his kids game his kids videos in Unity, and then we've taught him Unreal. So those are the basic video games. And what you do when you create something in Unity or Unreal, you create a three-dimensional world with three-dimensional objects. So in a typical video game, right now, Tam, one of your alumni, what he's doing for Call of Duty is he's just making digital things. Because any digital thing, like you take a chair, a table, when you make it in a video game, to make it three-dimensional, it has to exist independently of it. So there's the chair, there's the table. By the way, right now, you can buy these assets. So on Unity or Unreal Store, you can buy a chair or a table for like 10 bucks, digital asset. That's what we've been using to create content. We've been buying digital assets and then managing, like morphing them to what we need. So these digital things, once you build it in Unity or Unreal, it is a simple one step to make it a virtual environment that you can explore with VR, or to make it a 360 video. And in fact, the similar ways that you shoot a traditional video would be how you would shoot a 360 video or a 180 video. And I'll get to some questions here in a second, but I'll just kind of close this point. So where do I think things are going? I think in the future, I think you're gonna watch a lot of content in VR and AR, and you're gonna experience a lot of things, maybe 180 videos or 360 videos. I don't think 360 videos are gonna catch on, because the problem is if you're sitting in a chair and the action is happening behind you, you're not gonna turn all the way around. And they've already been making some of these 360 videos and animations where they have the action going on behind you, but like I'm sitting at my kitchen table and I don't want to have to like physically get up and turn around, so I just kind of ignore the video. So I think a lot of it will be 180. It's going to create a lot of interesting things with content, because actually video content might go back more to something like theater in the 180 context. Because how many of you guys are film majors, production, right? So you know with like videos, you make a lot of quick cuts, right? You can't do that with 180, because if you do that, you'll literally get motion sickness and maybe even have seizures, right? So, because you can't do lots of quick cuts like you can do with action films. So you're kind of immersed in the experience with these 180 and 360 videos. Right now, Tim, we can do on a budget of maybe $200 to $300 a 360 video or 180 video pretty easily. The quality's not quite at the level of 4K yet. I mean, there are some options, even the professional stuff, but that's kind of where things are going. So that's all of the technological side. If you have questions about the ethics, I'm actually working on a book that I'm like close to having a first copy done, maybe in a few weeks, on the ethical, philosophical stuff. So I'll open up to questions or comments. If you just have a comment, go ahead. Well, yeah, so the way I'm framing the ethics is, first of all, we have to frame things in divine providence. So from all eternity, God knew that this technology would come. He willed that this technology would come. He knows, he has perfect foreknowledge. Also, one of the things when I was working on the book on the plane, is this whole idea of where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. But you notice something there. Where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. There's almost an idea we could argue that sin abounds and perhaps multiplies. But the thing is sin multiplies, but grace multiplies even more. And when I was framing this in the chapter that I was writing last night when we were flying, my bet would be, with technology, many things will get much worse for many people. And then for many other people, things will get much better. And a lot will depend on the use of the technologies. It's a bad idea to sit a 12-year-old in front of a smartphone and give them unlimited access to the internet. I deal with so many porn addictions that started because their parents gave them smartphones at a young age, right? It's going to be an even worse idea to let your kid spend hours in VR and the metaverse type stuff. And yes, I think it will negatively adverse the poor. I work a lot with the poor. A lot of them already have serious technological addictions with smartphones and with pornography and things like that. We have a great ministry you guys should always consider at some point if you're going that missionary route. Vagabond, they're out of Steubenville, and they're in Greenville. And they deal with these low-income kids, and a lot of them really struggle with socializing and things like that. They're addicted to their phones, social media, all the mental health fallout. But if you go back to that, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. I think that's the fundamental framework to think of things. Sin will abound, and grace will abound all the more. And then kind of what I'm arguing is we can't stop this technology from coming. It's coming one way or another. Yeah, well, this is the interesting question about technology. And the bigger question you're kind of asking within that, and I'm working on a chapter on this, does technology make life better? Like, so, and I'm going to talk about this, actually I'm not going to talk about this tonight, but I might get it a little bit depending on who the audience is. Plato argued that books, or Socrates did, that books were making people more stupid because they didn't have the memory that they had before books. So this complaint against technology goes back to some of the earliest works of philosophical thought. And I'm going to flesh out that example more, but I'm 99.9% sure. I'm also a diocesan priest, so I'm not an academic. So like I'm going to have to go back and like pay bills and like manage people. So I don't research like a Dominican, right? I read things and I kind of cite them, but yeah. Socrates talks about that in one of the works of Plato. Remember, Plato writes about Socrates, so Socrates is complaining. No, but sorry, I didn't answer your question. So going back, what are the benefits? Well, technology changes our life. One of the things that I think me and Derry can relate to, before the advent of the smartphone, if you wanted to talk to a priest, you had to call the office from your house or from a payphone, and then you typically had to go there in person. And sometimes you would have to go before phones, you had to go there in person, set an appointment, and then come back at the appointment. And between there, if something happened to the priest or something happened to you where like you had a flat tire or whatever, you just didn't know. Like that was just life. You had a lot of uncertainty, right? Technology transformed my job that I can be working while I'm here. I'm communicating with people back home. I'm working. So the technology radically transformed. So what is going to be the transformations that'll take place with VR and AR? I think it'll be more common that before you visit a place, like physically, you'll visit virtually. So photogrammetry, the technology we're working on, we're going to have you could very easily, in 10 or 20 years, have a virtual version of this school that people would visit in VR and AR. Somebody was just showing me this app on the phone where it has the layout of the building when you put up your phone and you can explore it in AR. And all of this is at the point now where on a relatively small budget, you can do a good amount of it. So with VR and AR, that's one thing. For prayer, one of the projects I'm proposing is to virtually explore the Temple of Jerusalem and maybe see different churches. So one of the grandmothers we were at a VR showing, they're a relatively low-income family. I mean, not super low-income, but not enough that they're going to spend $10,000 on a trip to Rome. And so they said, well, now my kids can see all of these great churches of Europe, which I think is going back to my childhood, one of the things you guys don't realize, which ultimately dramatically transformed the church, was social media. Because before, like if you were in a parish in rural North Carolina or even California, and all the parishes around you, the music stunk and it was all modern art that just was ugly, like you didn't see what other parishes really looked like on a consistent basis, unless you like picked up a diocesan publication. But with social media now, we see churches and so much from around the world that we have access to so many examples of art that it really does have an influence on our expectations and things that we see. You can see so many different things. With VR, I can see that it will really up the game of people's expectations of churches, design, things like that. Because you'll be able to visit. I mean, it's really, right now, on a minimal budget, you could do a photogrammetry of any church in Europe, the Vatican, and make it available in VR and AR. I mean, right now, the challenges to doing these projects is not the costs, but it would be a lot of like the red tape and the bureaucracy. Well, so an easy example, what we're doing right now, we have a VR rosary. Actually, that's like the easiest like application. Tons of people said, I understood how to meditate on the rosary finally, because it's pretty simple. You're in the scene with Jesus, and the words of the rosary are going. So you're praying while meditating on the mystery. So like some practical things like that.
So is it just to have it, or is it to
Well, so there's catechesis. There's catechesis. And
it's evangelization?
yeah,
That's what the goal is?
exactly.
Okay.
Well, I mean, this actually, one of the things, I'd be curious your guys' take on this. Some of the things I don't like sometimes in church circles, especially from people in authority, is the overemphasis on the practical. Like, you know, and I understand market dynamics and there is a need for practicality. But when I was on the left, a big part of our view of being artists was to kind of create things. Like it wasn't always to be so practical. You know, it wasn't like trying to turn a dime to make money. There was kind of part of that. That was part of the ethics was, and I think there is a part, like my artist side would say, I want to create beauty because I believe beauty changes lives. And so if I can create a beautiful virtual reality experience, I do believe it could transform a life the way a book could or a movie could. I think one of the things, so you guys are film. One of the things that sometimes Christian movies and Christian art struggles with is that it seems a little forced, the direction they want you to go in terms of the output. Like, okay, you're trying to convince me to be a follower of Jesus Christ versus showing me a beautiful story. And when you see really the art that captivates us, like Tolkien and things like that, it doesn't feel like they're trying to manipulate you into a political decision or an ideological decision. And I think that's even, I mean, in my time, the big movie that had a huge impact was The Passion of Christ. And that was, yeah. I think virtual experiences could have a similar experience. But on a practical level, just catechesis. And that's where, when we eventually at some point, if we're paying the bills, it'll probably be because we're providing religious faith formation content. So like, for example, you're studying the sacrifice of the Mass, and you have a virtual experience where you explore the Old Testament, like you explore the Temple of Jerusalem. And let's say while you're exploring it, and technology exists to do this, that you click on different things and it gives you a Bible passage. Imagine this, if you're walking through the temple and it was historically accurate and you clicked on it, it told you where in the Bible it talks about that. And then you tie that in with the writings of the saints or things like that. And that's all within the grasp of the technology. Yeah. And by the way, I think right now we're still developing answers to these questions. Yeah. So there's a caveat. I'm still writing on this, so you're helping me to formulate the ideas. Well, let's talk about what is your assumption. Like one of the assumptions with technology, I started to brainstorm on the plane. I was really thinking about before coming here, is the assumption is that technology is artificial and that technology is not a part of creation. This is kind of a fundamental assumption of secular society. And so natural is, you know, a chemical versus olive oil, you know, things like that. Whereas olive oil is a chemical too, right? But we artificially create a chemical in a lab. So we distinguish between man-made as being artificial and natural things as being natural. So that distinction. Here's something to consider from a philosophical standpoint. I actually think of this as a proof of God's existence. Before your smartphone or computer came to exist, the law that governed it already existed. So we did not, when we created smartphones and computers, we did not actually create the laws that govern them. We discovered the laws that we govern them. But think about that for a second. If I make a video game, I choose the rules of the video game, right? On a kind of primitive level. But when we created technology, we did not actually create the rules that govern it. We had to discover them. The rules, the laws of computer science predate the existence of anything that exists. So the question philosophically, if this law pre-exists things, so right now the laws that will, the next step in technology, the laws for that already exist, even though we don't have the technology. So going back to God's foreknowledge, providence, and predestination, which is a hard thing to wrap your mind around. God already knew that this technology would exist. Creation is a part of technology is a part of creation from God's plan of eternity. That would be, I don't know if Derry, if you agree with that, but I would be curious. I mean, I'm testing these ideas out. But the laws of the technology pre-exist the technology. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, but going back to that, if we take the view that technology is a part of creation, then the question is, well, how will things adapt? And by the way, I think Mark Zuckerberg's a terrible philosopher. I mean, he founded Facebook. He didn't study Aristotle or Plato or Aquinas. Yeah.